Discover the tips and strategies that will help you achieve your retirement goals. I'm your host, James Knoll, and this is the podcast dedicated to helping you retire well. It all starts right here on Ready for Retirement. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ready for Retirement. I'm your host, James Knoll. The topic for today's episode is probably one of the areas of personal finance that people struggle with most. A lot of people are great savers, they're great investors, they're great at many different things, but the thing that trips so many people up, whether you have a lot of money or whether you have no money, is budgeting. Very few people feel as if they have a very firm grasp of exactly where they spend their money, and it's because it's hard. Budgeting can be really challenging. And so on today's episode, what I'm going to go through is I'm actually going to walk through my personal method for budgeting, how my wife and I budget, because as I've developed this, as I've developed the system and shared it with other people, clients, friends, people looking for help with budgeting, they found a tremendous amount of value in it. So I thought I would share it with all of you. The reason I do my budget this way, or before we jump into the details, is people think of budgeting. Budgeting is almost a bad word. You say budgeting and right away, probably the first thing you're feeling is a little bit of stress or a little bit of anxiety, because people have this sense that budgeting needs to be a full-time job. That budgeting means tracking every single expense and making sure everything adds up and that you don't go over or you don't exceed any categories, and it just becomes overwhelming. And the goal of financial planning, from my standpoint, the goal of doing the right thing financially is to have freedom from having to think about finances, freedom from having to think about tracking every little thing that I'm spending. So the goal of good budgeting isn't knowing more information. You've probably seen those spreadsheets, you've seen those PDFs, you have the worksheets that show you what categories should you be thinking about. We've all seen that, but it's not made any of us better budgeters. The goal of budgeting is not about knowing the right information. It's about designing a system that works with your natural tendencies instead of against them. So in my opinion, the traditional way of budgeting is not good. It's not helpful. It works for a very select number of people that are very disciplined with it. But proper budgeting, the way that I like to budget, it really isn't budgeting at all. It's about designing a system that allows me to monitor my spending in a way that doesn't require much effort. So that's going to be what we talk about in today's episode, is how do I budget, not so that you can do things exactly like I do, but because you can start to see a framework that I've built out, or the way I like to think about it, because I think there is a lot of value as I share this with people. So let's start with this. The system that I generated, as I mentioned, it's not about having more information. It's not about knowing the right categories to plan for. It's about designing a system that works with your natural tendencies instead of against them. And there's two things that this comes down to. Number one is creating clarity, and number two is creating constraints. Where this came from, by the way, is I actually wrote a blog on this. I'll link to it in the show notes. It's just called I'm a Financial Planner, and this is how I do my personal budget. I wrote a whole blog that kind of has pictures and kind of snapshots and visuals of all of this. So if that would be helpful, feel free to go to the show notes to download that as well, to view that blog. Show notes can be found at the readyforretirement.co webpage. But step one is creating clarity. And what that means is you need to start, and this is kind of intuitive, but how much do you actually have to spend? What do I mean by that? Well, what happens when we budget is, let's say that your take-home income is $10,000 per month, to use a round number. Well, $10,000 per month comes in and you think, wow, I've got a good amount of money that I can spend. Think of all the things I can buy with this. But the reality is that $10,000, and this is of course obvious, but that $10,000 isn't fully yours to be spent. So what you have to start with in budgeting, or as you design the system for you, is I like to break down expenses into a few different categories. The first category is called recurring fixed expenses. These are expenses that you've already committed to, and they're typically the same amount every single month. So what are some examples of this? Mortgage, or your rent, or your cell phone bill, utilities, gym memberships, insurance payments, cable, Netflix, Hulu. These are expenses that you have every single month, and you're going to pay these whether or not you ever pull out your debit card, or whether or not you ever pull out your credit card to swipe it. These are just expenses that are usually on auto pay. These are expenses that you've already committed to without having to make an intentional decision to go spend this money. Now, it's critical that you know these expenses because these will show you how much of your monthly income is already committed. How much of that $10,000 per month in this example has already been spent before you even take your wallet out of your pocket to go buy something? So let's go back to that example. Let's assume that $10,000 per month comes in, and let's assume that when you add up all your different recurring fixed expenses, let's assume that number is $6,000 per month. So between your mortgage, between your cell phone bills, between your utilities, your gym memberships, your Netflix subscription, all these things, let's assume that's $6,000 per month. Well, right away what that does for us is it says, okay, James, instead of you having $10,000 per month to spend, really you only have $4,000 per month to spend after we back out the recurring fixed expenses. So right away I can start to see what actually is left to be spent. Now, that's only once you've backed out the fixed expenses. The next thing that you need to do is you want to look at non-fixed monthly expenses. So this is the second category I like to look at. So I know what's going to be there on a recurring basis. We know what day the mortgage or insurance or rent is going to be paid. But there's some other expenses that you're going to have every month. They're not necessarily going to be fixed, but you're going to have them each month that you need to live. So this is typically going to be things like groceries or gas. I need groceries to eat each month. I need gas to get where I want to go each month. The difference here is I could potentially overspend on groceries. I could potentially overspend on gas. Now, it's going to be hard for you to overspend on your mortgage or on rent or insurance payments. Those amounts are fixed, and so that's why we start with those amounts. The difference with groceries, the difference with things like gas, is I could potentially overspend. It's very easy for me to walk into a grocery store and buy things that I don't necessarily need to have. So I want to account for that, and I'll kind of show you why a little bit later here, but I'm going to categorize these separately. So let's assume in this example that you spend, or I spend $700 per month on groceries and I spend $300 per month on gas. Those are my non-fixed monthly expenses. Going back to our example, if I have $10,000 per month coming in, now I know that $7,000 of this is actually already committed to essential expenses. So that's $6,000 of fixed recurring expenses and $1,000 between gasoline and groceries. Now, instead of having $10,000 per month to spend, I'm getting a lot of clarity that really I now only have $3,000 left to spend. Now, the next thing that I want to look at is discretionary expenses. So this is going to be things like dining out, entertainment, anything I buy on Amazon, any money that I want to go spend on things that I enjoy, any money that my wife Ashlyn wants to go spend on things that she enjoys. So these are the discretionary expenses. We don't need them to live, but we do have them as part of our budget. None of these expenses are bad. These are all good things, but we do need to have a budgeting system that does two things. Number one, it needs to show us how much we can spend in each of these categories. And number two, it needs to be easy to monitor how much we have remaining in the month to spend them. So let's see here. In our example, it looks like that we have $3,000 left to go spend on dining out, entertainment, and other fun things like that. If we have $10,000 per month coming in, $6,000 is going to fixed expenses, $1,000 is going to non-recurring, but also expenses that we need each month. $3,000 is left over. So it looks like we have that money that we can go take a trip, spend on dining out, do fun things like that. Well, not quite. There's still two categories that we haven't covered yet. The first one, and this is where I see people get tripped up so often, is those one-off expenses. How many times did you try to budget and everything was going perfectly, but then you had a car repair? Or how many times was your budget going just great, and then all of a sudden you decide to, or we realize I have to pay off that trip we paid for last month on the credit card? Or how many times were things going perfectly, and then there was a Christmas gift or a wedding gift or a baby shower gift, and you just get frustrated because you think, how on earth am I supposed to track all this? Well, that's what one-off expenses tend to do. And so here's a way that you can think about those. After several frustrating experiences, I finally realized something as I was doing my personal budget. I realized these one-off expenses really aren't all that one-off. They seem to happen almost every single month, whether it's a car repair or auto registration or wedding gifts or Christmas gifts or insurance premiums if not paid monthly or vacations or a doctor bill, property taxes if they aren't impounded. All of these things tend to happen, and we look at them and say, oh, that's just a one-off expense, but there's enough of these one-off expenses that they seem to happen every single month. Now, one thing that you could do is you could say, okay, well, when those things come up, when those one-off expenses come up, I'll just pull money from my savings or I'll just pull money from my emergency fund and then replenish it the next month. You could do that, but I like to reserve the emergency fund for emergencies. I almost treat that as if it's sacred. I don't want to tap into money that's in my savings account or in my emergency fund. I want that to be for an actual emergency. I could also take a look at this and say, okay, well, I'm just going to put this on the credit card. Okay, a car repair comes up. I'll just put this on the credit card, or travel comes up. I'll just put this on the credit card. But the challenge with this is I saved my monthly budget for the current month by just putting something on the credit card. But I only did that by ruining next month's budget. Now, next month's budget, I had to find out a way to account for this. So what I found and what I did instead is I set up things called sinking funds for the larger one-off expenses I knew would come up. And a sinking fund is just an account where you could set aside a little bit of money each month so that by the time that I had to pay for the expense, I already had the money set aside to do so. For example, let's say you wanted to save $6,000 for a vacation one time every year, just to use a nice simple example. Well, what I would do is instead of coming up to that vacation month and panicking and trying to scramble and figure out how on earth am I going to pay for this $6,000 vacation, what I would do instead is I would set aside $500 every single month for 12 months so that at the end of the year, I would have $6,000 set aside. Now what I could do is I could pay for that vacation and it wouldn't ruin my monthly budget to do so. So it's amortizing. It's kind of taking that one-off fixed expense and it's averaging that out to say, how can you prepare for this throughout the year, as opposed to blowing up your budget in that month and then getting frustrated into deciding you're just never going to budget again because it doesn't work. So this was one of the big things that allowed us to actually budget in a way that was effective. What we did is we looked at all the categories where we spend money on a one-off basis. This is things like gifts. This is things like vacations, maybe auto registration, car repairs, things like that. Things that we knew we were going to have to spend money on, but they didn't happen every single month. Then what we determined is we determined how much do we want to have set aside for each of these expenses each year. What is a typical vacation going to look like for us? Or how many vacations do we want to go on? Let's find out how much that's going to cost. Then let's divide that number by 12. And then let's start budgeting for that monthly. What that does is that gives us a lot more clarity over how much are these vacations actually costing. Can we comfortably fit it into our monthly budget? And if not, well, maybe that tells us something. Maybe that's something that we need to explore further of how much are we willing to pay on things like this and what is the amount that makes sense in our budget. What about things like auto registration or car repair? Can we set a little bit of money aside each month so when those things come up, instead of putting that on a credit card or scrambling to figure out how to pay it, we just pull money from that savings account and pay for this expense in cash. So what we actually did is we opened up separate high yield savings accounts for each of these one-off expenses at a separate bank. So why we did that is we wanted this money to be accessible, but not easy to access. We wanted to create some friction between that money and between our normal bank. We didn't want it to be too easy to transfer money from our vacation fund or from our gift fund or from our car savings fund to spend on a monthly basis. We want access to it, but we do want it to be a little bit more difficult to access. So we intentionally set up a separate bank account, which just made it less likely that we would cheat and spend that money on something else. And those accounts are out of sight, out of mind. So when I pull up my regular bank account, I don't even see these accounts, which I prefer. I don't want to see how much I have in travel. I don't want to see how much we have in our gift fund. I don't want to see how much we have in our car purchase fund. I just want that money to be separate. So by the time I actually need it, I can log in and be pleasantly surprised to see what months of savings did. And then I can go pay for that vacation in cash. Or then I can go pay for that expense in cash. Now, I can also earn a little bit of interest. Now, interest rates are so low that it's not going to be much, but these are all expenses that maybe only happen once every few months or once a year. And I don't want my money just to sit around. I want it to at least be earning a little bit of interest for me. So once I figured out how much I needed to save each month for our one-off expenses, the next step was to add that number up, add up all the monthly savings amount for those fixed expenses, and add that back into our budget on a monthly basis. So for example, if I want to put $500 per month aside for travel, and if I want to put $200 a month aside for gifts, and if I want to put, let's say, $300 a month for a car purchase fund, well, if I add all those up, that's $1,000 per month. So that needs to now get added back into the monthly budget so that I can see the true cost of that. It's hard to see the true cost of some of these items when they're only paid for once a year, but if I can average that out on a monthly basis and add it back into the monthly budget, now all of a sudden I get a much clearer sense for how much is being spent. So back to our example. If I start with $10,000 per month coming in, I know $6,000 is going to fixed recurring expenses. I know that 1,000 is going to non-fixed recurring expenses, and 1,000 per month is going to those one-off expenses that are going to be averaged out each month. Now what I have is I have $2,000 left per month. Now their last expense I need to think about here, before even thinking about the fun stuff or discretionary expenses, is investing in savings. That has not yet been accounted for through this budgeting process. Now, let me clarify that real quick. If I'm making 401k contributions, then those 401k contributions, those are getting deducted right from my paycheck. So let's say that I've done my financial planning. The only savings I really need to be doing right now is my 401k. Maybe my emergency fund's already funded. I don't have any outside savings. I just need to be putting money into my 401k, to use a really simple example. Well, that is kind of already accounted for this, because the $10,000 per month after taxes that I'm using to base my budget on, it's also after 401k contributions. So that 401k is already done. Now, if I haven't been doing 401k contributions, and if my financial plan, for example, says I need to be saving $500 per month to a Roth IRA, well, then that $500 per month, that does need to be part of this budget, because that's not coming out of my paycheck before the net income hits my bank account. So the next piece to add in here is anything that you're doing for investings or savings. So maybe you're putting $500 per month into a Roth IRA and $500 per month into just a regular investment account. There's another $1,000. So what we see now is once I start with $10,000, just to bring it back to the beginning, and then I back out fixed expenses, and then I back out recurring but non-fixed expenses, and then I back out the one-time expenses, and then I back out the investing and the saving. Now I really have $1,000 left in this example. And it's that $1,000 left that then we can say that's fully discretionary money. That's what we can actually spend, because that money doesn't need to go towards something that's either already accounted for, like a mortgage or like insurance premiums. It doesn't need to go to food or groceries or gas. It doesn't need to go to save for these one-time expenses. It doesn't need to go to savings. That $1,000, that's what really we have to spend in a fully discretionary manner. So what my wife and I do is we have kind of three categories of discretionary expenses. We have joint expenses that if we're going to go on date night, if we're going to go do something fun together, we allocate a certain amount of the budget to that. Then each of us has our own separate just fun money. She can do with hers whatever she wants and doesn't need to ask permission from me. I can do with mine whatever I want and I don't need to ask permission from her. It's kind of an amount that we intentionally set aside each month that allows us to feel as if we can go do things that we want to do without having to constantly be talking about expenses or be talking about what we can spend. And it doesn't create any disagreements because I don't have to ask her what I can spend money on. She doesn't have to ask me what she can spend money on, but it's limited to an agreed upon amount each month. Now, once you get to this point, if you look at this and say, oh my gosh, there's only this amount left to actually spend, that's not enough. Well, you have to ask yourself the question, where's that going to come from? If you want to be able to have more discretionary expenses, more entertainment, or more kind of money that each of you can spend, it's a pretty simple equation. You can either add more income so that more is left after all of this that you can spend on discretionary expenses, or you can cut expenses somewhere else. Can you cut money from the grocery budget? Can you cut money from some old subscriptions that you're no longer using? Can you cut money from the vacation fund that you have? I'm just kind of making up examples here. But this is just math, and this is how you create that clarity of you can't spend more money than you're bringing in each month without running into a lot of trouble over time. So this first exercise just shows us that everything's a trade-off. The more you spend in one category, the less you can spend in another. So this allows you to really build in a really intentional amount that you want to spend in each category. And then that is something that you have a lot of clarity on. It's not just something that happens. It's not just something that's reactionary and you spend money as you need to. It's you telling your money where you want it to go. So that is just step one. Most people, they say, okay, James, nothing new, nothing revolutionary about this. That's something that people always do. If I get the Excel spreadsheet, this is exactly what I do. The second step of this is what has been most helpful for us. And the second step is creating constraints, because you could go through all the steps I've laid out and have perfect clarity as to how much you should be spending, but it would still be very easy to blow your budget just by swiping your credit card on whatever I wanted. Maybe I want to only spend $700 per month on groceries, but it's just so easy to go swipe my credit card and spend $800, $900, $1,000. Maybe I only want to spend this amount of money on entertainment or date nights or whatever it is, but it's just too easy to go spend money that we don't have by swiping a credit card. And what this is, and I'm going to kind of come back to this in a second, but this is what hit me. Saying, okay, how do I prevent this? And there's something called Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law says work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. Work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. Now, we recognize this. There's plenty of examples in everyday life that you would see this in. Do you remember when you had an essay that was due in college? Your professor would assign an essay and it wasn't due for a month. You had a whole month to complete it. So when did you really get to work? Well, the night before. You maybe skimmed some stuff and did some other things and maybe did some quote unquote research leading up to it. But you really did nothing substantial until the night before, and you would always finish your essay on time. Or maybe your boss gives you a deadline for a project that's due. When does that deadline get completed? Well, the minute that it's due. Whatever the time we have to complete a project is, we're going to take up the full amount of time. Well, the same thing applies to our finances. If I go to the grocery store and I only have a $100 bill and that's all I have to spend, well, I'm going to spend all of it. Well, if I go to a grocery store and I have a $200 or two $100 bills to spend, I'm also going to spend all of it. In the same way that work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion, or the time available that's allotted to it, so do our finances. Whatever amount that we have to spend, we will find a way to spend all of it. It's just a rule of nature. And it's this law of nature that gets us all so tripped up. Because like I said at the beginning, it's not enough to know what to do. I now know exactly how much I want to spend in each category through that exercise we just went through. But just because I know how much I want to spend in that category does not mean that I'm going to spend that amount in that category. And what I determined, or what I saw, is I needed a system to help me implement this without having to maintain incredible discipline or focus on my expenses 24/7. Most people, the way they budget is they go through that exercise we just went through, and then every single day as they go to the grocery store or the gas station or go out to eat or spend any money, the classic budgeting system is they then go in and categorize each transaction. Maybe they have an app, maybe they use a spreadsheet, and it takes a lot of time to go in and actually have to categorize that or track this throughout the month. I don't want that. I'm a financial planner and I'd rather not have to think about budgeting. So it's not like, oh, James, you can do this. You're a financial planner and you enjoy it. No, I wanted a system that allowed me not to think about finances and spending. I just wanted to create something that it was a system that would build guardrails around my spending. How do I James-proof my budget? How do I determine how much I want to spend in each category? And then how do I actually do that without having to track it 24/7? And my guess is if you're listening to this, you also don't want to have to feel as if you're tracking your expenses 24/7. It's exhausting. No one really likes it. And there's a lot of other things we'd rather be doing. So the big realization for me was the only way for me to do this was to stop spending using a credit card. And the reason for that is just using credit cards for us and for our method of doing this, it required too much effort to keep track of my spending. Because with a credit card, I had to track this month's expenses that I would pay for with next month's money, while I was trying to use this month's money to pay for things I bought and already forgot about last month. And it just became this big confusing mess of how do I know if I'm on track this month when the only things I see that are due were things I already spent last month. And what did I spend on money on last month? I already forgot. I don't really remember. So just created this thing where I would try to start budgeting and stop and try and stop and try and stop because it was just too overwhelming and too exhausting to track this. So instead, knowing that I needed to just build guardrails against my tendency to overspend, against all of our tendencies to overspend, instead my wife and I, we just opened up separate checking accounts for the different categories in our budgets. So what we did is that way we had complete visibility as to how much we had left throughout each month and how much we would have left to spend. So for example, I mentioned that we have recurring expenses. So if $10,000 per month was coming in and our recurring expenses were $6,000, at the beginning of each month, I would simply slide $6,000 into this separate account, knowing that throughout the course of the month, that was going to be drawn down to zero. So things like rent or mortgage or insurance premiums, those were all assigned on a recurring basis to get debited directly from this one checking account. Then we would have other checking accounts. We'd have a grocery account, kind of grocery and household goods. We'd have a gas checking account. I would have a James money account. We would have an Ashland money account. We would have an entertainment account. And what this allowed us to do, it kind of sounds like overkill to some people, but for us, this account or this system allowed me to log into my bank. I could pull up my mobile app and I could see exactly how much we left to spend on things like entertainment or exactly how much I had to spend of my money, or exactly how much Ashlyn had left to spend of her money, or exactly how much we had left to spend on whatever category. And instead of tracking things, it was just a very easy system. If halfway through the month I've spent all my money because I wanted to do a bunch of fun things the first couple weeks of the month, great. But once my checking account hit zero, I'm done for the month. And I'm fine with that. It gave me the ability to be intentional about where I was spending money, knowing that if I'm going to overspend the first parts of the month, that's totally fine. I just can't do anything again until next month. In the show notes, like I said, there's actually a link to the blog that I wrote that outlined all of this and actually has some visuals and some snapshots, literally of the bank accounts that we use, with, of course, account number information blotted out. But that information is there. So if that visuals, I know, probably helpful to see as we look at this. But the beautiful thing about all this is it took some time to create this system. It took some time to set up the accounts. It took some time to kind of get used to not using credit cards for spending. But the really cool part is each month, it is a minimal amount of time I actually spend on budgeting. At the beginning of each month, we look at our budget. We look at how much income is going to come in this month. How do we allocate where we want that money to go? And then all we do is fill up the different buckets. And I can log into my app once or whenever I want, daily, weekly, whatever. And I can see, okay, do I have $500 per month left that I personally can spend? Is it $1,000? Is it $100? Is it 50? I don't need to track anything. All I need to do is look at the remaining balance. And once that remaining balance is done, then it's done until next month. When I used to try to track expenses every month or every day throughout the month, there was just a lot of effort going into that. It took a lot of time to really see where do we stand with how we're actually spending money compared to how we want to be spending money. Now, if I want an actual or an accurate picture of my financial situation to see how am I spending in relation to the budget we laid out, it takes me all 5 seconds. And I'll joke that even then, that's just because Face ID on my iPhone takes 3 seconds to let me into my banking app. But once I'm there, it's very easy to see exactly how much I have left in each category. In the past, it was much more complicated to understand where I really stood. Now all I have to do is take a look at my bank account because I started by creating clarity on exactly how much I wanted to spend in each category. My wife and I, we looked at that together to say how much are we willing to spend in each category. And then 2, we built guardrails around our natural tendency to overspend. And we did that by saying, let's remove credit cards from the way we budget. It was just too difficult to manage that way. By using debit cards and checking accounts, and again, this is just the way that we do it, it allows us to see exactly how much money is actually left, not trying to balance pending charges on last month's bill and this month's bill and the bank account compared to the credit balance. It just became too much of a mess. And by the end of it, my brain was tired and I just wanted to give up on even caring where I was spending money, and so I would. But not anymore. All I have to do is take that one quick look at my accounts and I know exactly how I'm tracking towards my monthly spending. And the best part is once it's set up, it requires minimal ongoing effort. So this is just the system that we use. There's a lot of ways to do budgeting. I'm sharing this because this is what's worked for myself and my wife. I know this has worked for a lot of clients I've shared this with. I know this has worked for a lot of friends that I've shared this with. And it doesn't need to be an all or nothing thing. People will borrow certain aspects of this. Some people are all in on this. But what works about this is it's not trying to shove more information into your brain about how should you be budgeting and how should you be tracking it. It's saying, how do we naturally work? What are those natural laws that all of us are subject to just in our own daily lives? And then how do we design systems around that? So much of financial planning is designing systems that motivate good behavior and that disincentivize poor behavior. And this is one of those. Now, one of my favorite writers and thinkers is a guy named James Clear. He wrote a book called Atomic Habits, which is an amazing book. And he has a weekly newsletter that he sends out. And in an email one time, he sent something that stuck with me. It's a quote that I saved and that I'll look at often. And the quote says, to quote James Clear, "The idea that change is hard is one of the biggest myths about human behavior. The truth is, you change effortlessly and all the time. The primary job of the brain is to adjust your behavior based on the environment. Design a better environment, change will happen naturally." End quote. So this system for me, this budgeting system is my better environment. If I want change to happen, then I need to design a better environment. By designing this environment, my spending patterns changed naturally after setting things up appropriately on the front end. We no longer have to budget. We no longer even really have to track things. We just have to monitor the banking app to see how much we have left to spend. And the beautiful thing is most of the work was already done for us as a result of setting up the right system on the front end. So like I said, this is our system. It works great for us. I wanted to share it more than anything, just to share the framework of how we think about this and what are some things that we can all do just to naturally incentivize or build in guardrails around what we're doing to ensure that we're tracking with the goals that we have. So if this is helpful, if you want like to learn more about this, go to the show notes, readyforretirement.co. Show notes for this episode. There will be a link to this blog post where I outline all this in more detail and actually have some visuals of how we set it up so you can see what that looks like. I hope this was helpful. Budgeting is hard. Most people struggle with it. If you struggle with this, don't feel like you're alone. Everyone has. I struggle with this, and I was in this business for a long, long time before I finally figured out what worked for me. So look to design that better environment, whether it's something like what I'm talking about or something on your own. But the budgeting is kind of the lifeblood of everything else that goes on in financial planning. The cash flow in and the cash flow out, that's really what drives our ability to be on track and to accomplish the goals that we have. So thank you for listening. As always, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Ready for Retirement podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and let me know by leaving a 5-star review. And as always, for a list of the notes and the resources mentioned in today's episode, you can find those at the Ready for Retirement website, which is readyforretirement.co. That's readyforretirement.co. And if you have a question that you would like for me to answer in a future episode, then you can also go to the Ready for Retirement website, readyforretirement.co. There's a page called Submit Your Question where you can submit a question for me to answer in a future episode. Thanks as always for listening, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, it's me again for the disclaimer. Please be smart about this. Before doing anything, please be sure to consult with your tax planner or financial planner. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment, tax, legal, or other financial advice.